review of just how critically important Internet access is for today's businesses. In spite of any inherent risk, modern businesses really have little choice but to connect to the Internet. There's really no getting around that. So next, I'm going to introduce Dan Vucinic, our Director of Technical Sales, and he's going to talk about the role of the service provider in ensuring its network is designed and managed to meet business demands for service reliability, performance, and the future interoperability and scalability. In a prior role, Dan actually led a team of network engineers responsible for Allstream's Internet services. And then finally, Carlos Henriquez, a security architect and subject matter expert, will talk about 5 major cybersecurity threats that are facing businesses today and what, if anything, can be done to protect against them. So let's talk about the critical role of business Internet. Now, to put the present into context, let's think back to the late 1990s, and this was a time when businesses were just starting to get connected to the Internet. Now, if you think back then, most organizations were using the Internet access for just a few applications. The most common ones you'd find would be email and web. So email to communicate with customers, suppliers, employees, and a corporate informational website to establish just a basic online presence. I'm not even talking e-commerce here, just basically brochureware. Now, if the Internet access went down, it was an inconvenience, but the reality was the business continued pretty much as usual. You could still take orders through the call center. Employees could still share files over the LAN or the wide area network. In other words, the organization continued to function. Now, let's fast forward to the present, and things are much more complicated. So today, the Internet is used for a vast array of applications, not just email, but now you've got collaboration, social business, access to cloud compute infrastructure, voice and video services, and a lot more. In fact, 30% of SMBs subscribe to some form of voice over IP service, and more than 80% of enterprise companies are using VoIP or are even engaged in VoIP trials. So what does this mean? Well, if that one Internet access is compromised, those applications may perform poorly or may not be available at all. And many of these are business-critical tools. So if they go away, business activity grinds to a halt. The impact on the business is immediate and negative. So what are the implications of that? Well, you've got damage to reputation, lost business, employee productivity takes a hit, data recovery, pressure on the help desk, and strained operations. I'm not going to go deeply into all of these, but let's take a look at the first 3. So damage to reputation. According to a recent Dun & Bradstreet survey, 18% of businesses describe the impact of IT outages on their reputations as damaging, not surprisingly. Indeed, we saw a few years ago with Sony a security breach, for example, and that compromised customer data and exposed that company to legal liability, and actually financial losses were considerable as well. In most jurisdictions, there are actually regulatory frameworks, such as privacy legislation, that businesses have to adhere to. Let's look at lost business. Think about retail stores. Because their point-of-sale terminals rely on Internet access, the loss of Internet connectivity can impact both the online and the brick-and-mortar storefronts. In a survey of consumers, research firm Standish Group found that nearly 50% of customers will avoid a retailer or brand in the future if they had to wait longer than 5 minutes at the checkout. Employee productivity. So you think about software as a service applications like Office 365, Salesforce, Eloqua. They're being adopted by businesses of all size. And the performance of these applications depends really entirely on the quality of the Internet access. So often when an end user complains that an application is considered it's running slow, it's actually the result of latency on the access. That's the delay that's introduced by traffic having to take multiple hops along the path to its final destination on the Internet. So again, it's not just the reliability of the access, but how well it performs. All right, now that I've done a little stage setting, Dan Vucinic is going to speak about how a service provider designs an Internet network so that you've got maximum availability, performance, and future scalability.
Well, thanks, Craig. The first thing that people always think about is redundancy, which is obviously a must. You talk about diversity of the nodes in the core, in the access layers. They have to be geographically diverse. The hardware has to be diverse, cards diversity. Your outside fiber plant cable has to have different routes, as well as your inside wiring. So absolutely no single point of failure. But that's nothing new. But equally important going forward is you really have to have a next generation IP converged architecture. As we continue to see the bandwidth explosion happen and will continue to happen over the years to come, it's really that the data within that bandwidth explosion is really unpredictable. It's dynamic due to different trends like social media, cloud services, disaster recovery, business continuity, etc. So not only you have to have a network that can manage the bandwidth, but also has to be intelligent and flexible network so you can manage these changes in real time. So looking forward, businesses will be interfacing with service providers very, very differently than what they do today. They'll be easily ordering bandwidth on demand services through simple portals, and their applications will be able to drive changes in the network using software-defined networks, or SDN.
SDN, now that's something I keep hearing about more and more. What is it, or what exactly does that mean?
SDN is a future webinar on its own, Craig, but very briefly, it's basically an open standard that you apply to the network that connects to your business applications using secure APIs. And really what it does is it essentially allows the business application to program the network. It could be bandwidth changes, it could be routing changes based on latency performance in real time to meet the business needs. Some people call it network as a service. So real exciting times ahead for businesses as they'll need that service provider to take their business to the next level.
Okay, the next element, national fiber optic network. Now, let's suppose I have a business that operates out of a single location. Why should I really care about this? Like, what advantages are gained by having a national fiber optic network?
Well, in addition to the next-gen converged IP network that I just spoke about, you have to have a next-generation optical network as well. And having it cross-country, a national network, all of your IP traffic really rides on top of your optical network. So not only, again, your network has to be highly scalable and to do multiple 100 gig wavelengths, but it has to be super low latency, high speed, having that one national network across the country with all the different multiple U.S. access points. It's a shorter, faster route with multiple levels of diversity. And having that intelligent network can do many wonderful things like automate the service delivery, reroute traffic dynamically, truly becomes a touchless network.
And peering. So, Dan, when we talk about peering, why is that important and beneficial to businesses?
Well, peering is really how we directly connect with our internet partners. And basically, the more partners you directly peer with, the better it is for customers. Reasons are that it reduces your delay and latencies as customers and businesses don't have to go through multiple providers to get to the end destination. So your routing is optimized, you have greater performance, you have maximized redundancy for that survivability. And in fact, Allstream in particular was deemed by the Canadian Internet Registry Authority as the most connected network in Canada, and globally connected with all the Tier 1 providers in the U.S. In addition, we also directly peer with major content providers, all the big guys like Google, Akamai, Microsoft, Yahoo, Facebook, Netflix, etc. And again, that's the benefit is for the businesses, again, to have that faster, more consistent access to the content they need. So this plays a critical role as we go forward, especially if businesses start using software as a service. It really relies on the improved performance of the network.
Okay. So speaking of performance then, so if a business has concerns about the performance of the network, are there reporting tools available that can help, present a clear picture of what's actually going on? And then, if so, what steps are taken to address those performance issues?
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, Craig, as the internet is used for more critical business applications going forward, you absolutely have to be able to measure and monitor and report on the performance of the network. So it's critical to have these tools available for that tracking, for the real-time utilization, latency, packet loss, etc. So the businesses that have the IT managers provides them a lot of valuable information and guidance to not only do their day-to-day jobs if there's some real-time issues and so forth, but also to plan out their future network requirements in terms of as their bandwidth utilization increases, you want to get ahead of that curve and make sure that you upgrade your service proactively before incurring any performance issues on the network. So these tools are available as a package as part of your service.
Okay, so there's no additional cost for, say, an application server putting software on it?
Yeah, that's correct. These are web-based tools that Allstream includes as part of the internet service access.
That's good. All right. Now, before we get to our next topic, which is IPv6. Now, Dan, as you know, the internet's rapidly running out of those IPv4 addresses. And I think within the next few years, any business connected to the internet is really going to have to make that transition to IPv6. So before I ask you to weigh in on the subject, I thought it would actually be great to poll our listeners to get an idea of their readiness for IPv6. Okay, so folks, to take the survey, just click on the radio button next to your response. So your choices are: my organization is IPv6 enabled, my organization has developed an IPv6 migration plan, my organization has yet to develop an IPv6 plan, and what is IPv6? So submit your answer and we'll take a look at the results. Take a few seconds here. Okay, so we have, wow, nearly half. My organization has yet to develop an IPv6 migration plan. So absolutely pay attention to this next section. I'd recommend, and we'll talk about what you need to do to take yourselves there.
Yeah, the results were kind of what I expected. Some businesses are aware and have started planning, and some look like they're behind or not really sure what IPv6 is. But as you mentioned, Craig, there is that depletion of available IPv4 addresses, and the industry has moved to IPv6 addresses, which really are addresses with 128 bits instead of 32 bits. And as you talked about earlier, as the Internet of Things are happening out there, there's a big wave of devices, applications, systems, and so forth that require IPv6 addresses going forward. And unfortunately, these are IPv4 and IPv6 addresses are two versions of IP protocols, but they're basically incompatible with each other. So that's the transition to IPv6 will not be effortless or transparent. So very important to develop a sensible strategy, a project plan to really make this conversion work. To make it successful, you really have to have the business itself IPv6 ready, as well as your service provider. They have to be ready together to make this effective. So from a service provider, the network has to be able to support IPv4 traffic, IPv6 traffic, as well as the ability to translate between the two protocols through the network, something that we've deployed called the dual stack architecture. Now, from a business perspective, IT managers need to take a look at and upgrade their systems, their applications as well. Now, not all elements need to be upgraded at the same time, so really careful planning, prioritization around what initial deployments I really have to do to make it really cost-effective for the business. But there are many things to consider, including security. It could be somewhat higher latency until the outside world really gradually adopts to that IPv6.
Okay, so Dan, to sum up, if there's really one piece of advice you can give our audience, it's...
If you haven't started yesterday, I highly recommend that you start as early as this afternoon talking about IPv6.
So that's so the 48% of you plus out there, just if we can help you with that too. So thank you, Dan. That's great. And now please stick around for the Q&A later in the program. And now I'd like to shift to our next speaker, Carlos Henriquez, who is going to talk about Internet security and risk exposure. So Carlos is a security architect and subject matter expert. Carlos, you meet with businesses just about daily to talk about Internet security, and you've come across some common misconceptions. Do you find that businesses are truly taking these issues seriously?
They are, but again, there's a lot of marketing out there, and there are a few. So, for example, for online applications, firewalls really primarily open holes. So applications like web servers, they might as well be directly on the internet. There is no protection. Now, next generation firewalls have added security features like IPS, AV, URL filtering, and others. But except for IPS, the security features are generally meant to protect users going out, if they're enabled. And as for bandwidth DDoS attacks, the firewall or IPS can help if your pipe is flooded. Now, on DDoS side, the hacktivist group Al-Qassam has been hitting the U.S. financials for about a year. They have regularly generated bandwidth attacks in the range of 40 to 60 gigs. SpamHawks was a victim of the largest recorded DDoS attack in the range of 300 gig. With these numbers, even your ISP is at risk.
And then a lot of businesses assume, I'm not one of those big guys. I'm not a big bank. I'm too small for someone to actually target me. Why would they care about what I have?
Right. Well, when Al-Qassam started attacking the U.S. financial system, the ISPs and the banks, they were caught off guard. And you know what? The attacks were pretty successful. But things have changed. In the latest, what they call the fourth phase, things seem to have a little less success. So now they're going after the smaller, softer targets. Guess what? Smaller and mid-sized businesses.
So let's go into some of those what you call the top 5 cybersecurity threats that are facing businesses today. So businesses, and I guess businesses of all sizes, are facing these risks. We have advanced persistent threats, distributed denial of service, internal threats, BYOD, which is bring your own device, big IT trend there, and another big IT trend, cloud. So organizations adopting cloud services, which also opens up to potential risks. So let's start first talking about advanced persistent threats.
You know what? I like to think of APTs as drilling for oil. Once the attack is successful, these folks aim to pump out as much data as possible without creating any noise or damage. So, as we heard, Nortel, they supposedly were compromised for over 10 years. Stuxnet seems to be around for 5 years. So, NSS Labs put it in a different way. TPA, or Targeted Persistent Attacks. The attack process is advanced. They're tenacious, and time is on their side. But the actual attacks are aimed at known vulnerabilities. You need to look at the malware like any other criminal industry. It's what they can steal for profit. Reusing exploits against unknown vulnerabilities is cheaper. Call it code reuse. So unpatched software is the prime risk. So many apps and limited resources, patching is never 100% done. This is why prioritization is important. Zero-day exploits are expensive to develop, and once used, their value drops. We have to accept a new approach to malware. We need to assume, and this is interesting, that our network is now compromised or will be in the future. Not the kind of thing your AV tells you. APTs use malware that will bypass standard security controls. There's a lot of tools in criminal services to make sure your malware bypasses the latest AV DAT files. Some even have paid-for-use services, just in case your skills are not up to par. So the next time you have a suspicious file, send it to virustotal.com. See how the AVs disagree with each other. But these folks are friendly. You can trust them. But the businesses, they want to know what's the risk. As a business owner or executive, they hear all sorts of malware coming out every day. So why worry now? Well, the good news. If your users have just been caught up in a malware campaign, but your organization wasn't targeted, the malware may just sit and wait. And no, your AV probably won't catch it. So risk is low until someone finds that you're valuable. But the bad news, if you're in a target list, time is your enemy. This is where the advanced APT process kicks in. They'll discover your network, find critical data, eventually extract it out continuously. It's like having a parasite, and it doesn't go away.
So what can a business do to protect itself?
Well, you need to identify anomalies in your network, and this is easier said than done. You have to start an offensive campaign. Start mining your network events, application and security events for the needle in a haystack. It's crucial to have visibility into all your communication channels, including your web protocols and encrypted channels. A centralized log management system, or SIEM, is a must. But again, very important, with context. These logs will just be more noise, and probably some of you have already had that experience. The key is adding threat intelligence, possibly integrated into a SIEM. Adding malware expertise and employing custom signatures will turn on floodlights on that stealthy malware. Now, if this is not your area of expertise, make sure your security service supplier has this capability.
Okay, next, distributed denial of service attacks. Carlos, what exactly are these?
These are thousands of compromised machines on the internet, basically called botnets. They're under remote control, normally called command and control center. These could be your PC, could be a business PC, could be anybody. Botnets can be available for hire, generate DDoS, spam, and other malicious content. They're very versatile, unfortunately. Some even have free 5-minute DDoS tests. You'd be surprised how many 5-minute DDoS tests there are out there. And all you really need to turn this on is a credit card. So for network DDoS attacks, they're primarily anything that floods your circuit. So the key point here is there's no amount of bandwidth you can purchase to protect yourself. Application DDoS attacks are much stealthier. They'll take out the application, but with little bandwidth. As for the duration, it can be a few minutes, if you're lucky, to hours or days. We just learned, actually, news just came out that on September 24th, there was a DDoS attack lasting over 9 hours. Some Canadian examples, the NDP leadership race earlier this year, I think from what I heard, the actual election was delayed by 30 minutes because of a DDoS attack. TD Bank was publicly hit, reportedly by Al-Qassam, with over 30 to 40 gigs of attack. And it's not just the big guys. One of our smaller customers was under DDoS attack for over a week, Greg. So some interesting scenarios in 2012 regarding DDoS. The hacktivist group Al-Qassam generated DDoS attacks, as I mentioned, with 30 to 40 gigs, sometime reaching 100. The Spamhaus attack, as I mentioned, was 300 gig. This is supposedly the largest known DDoS attack ever. Now, the spoof attack is generated using something called misconfigured public DNS servers, specifically set up as open recursive resolvers. So about 30,000 of these little critters were used for the 300 gig. But there's about 25 or 30 million of these things out there.
25 to 30 million machines.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Imagine how much damage this thing can cause. So as for Al-Qassam, they have made DDoS an art form. First, they'll scan your network and applications for weaknesses. And by the way, does this sound like a penetration test? Second, using their Brobot botnet, it has two general attack modes. Bandwidth flooding attacks using TCP/SYN, UDP, ICMP floods. Now, on the other hand, they also have low bandwidth application attacks, a little stealthier, usually aimed at the login process. And that's why some of these attacks will prevent people from actually logging in. Third, and even more dangerous, they will actually monitor the effect on the victim. Hopefully, that's not you or us. And if you start winning the fight, guess what? They'll change tactics on you in real time.
Wow, that sounds like a really sophisticated, very highly organized operation.
Yes, and unfortunately, they're in the fourth phase. So you can imagine they're getting better. But DDoS may just be a sign. The U.S. feds have warned financial institutions that DDoS attacks can be a diversion for a penetration attack. Imagine, if you were under attack with all hands on deck defending your bandwidth attack, you may just miss the real attack.
So is there much that you can do to protect yourself against these?
Well, of course there is. Now, the bandwidth DDoS, the ISP or DDoS scrubbing service, they need to drop this in the cloud. Once your pipe is flooded, there's nothing you can have on your side. Otherwise, again, by the time that the attack reaches the circuit, it's way too late. In effect, it's like having a cable cut. For the application, a little stealthier, these can be detected and stopped with on-site, inline appliances. They're application aware. They're especially useful for protecting your firewalls and IPS devices from what we call state exhaustion attacks. There are also specialized cloud services to protect against some applications, like web. Now, to handle this, it's not just technology. The organization's incident response team needs to have representation from, you guessed it, management, the network team, the server and application team, and of course the security team. We need to work as a group to defend against the one team out there. So to be effective, you got to run regular DDoS and penetration tests at both the network and the application levels. Practice defending against complex attacks. Find your weaknesses before they do.
Okay.
Lastly, be aware of something called TDoS, Craig. This is interesting coming out. It's called telephony denial of service. Really what it is, it's fake phone calls, and they're usually aimed at support centers or they flood calling centers.
Okay, that's a new one I haven't heard of. But, Carlos, if I work for a smaller organization, and let's say I'm that one guy, the one guy responsible for IT, I don't have really anyone else to bring to a response team. I mean, how can I get help with this?
Yeah, Craig, there are services out there. And depending on your technical expertise, you can be the one team.
Okay.
But especially when we get into malware protection And especially in analyzing all these events, a service is probably the best choice.
Okay, so internal threats. Now, when I think of internal threats, names like, thinking of Bradley Manning, Edward Snowden, these are the so-called whistleblowers who got access to, and they leaked some really classified U.S. Army and NSA secrets recently. So, I got to think that a lot of IT and network managers see examples like this and they think, if the U.S. Army and the National Security Agency can't prevent a security breach, then what hope do I have of stopping it from happening in my organization?
Well, and to your point, exactly. Internal threats are about protecting your crucial data. It could be trade secrets, personal identifying information, healthcare, financial, you name it. Whatever makes your company tick. But the perimeter, as we know, is dynamic. And now, as we're finding out, the critter is actually mobile. So if a device, a laptop, smartphone, tablet, whatever, is lost or stolen today, really just think about it. Can you confirm to your management that the data is safe? And as we know, it seems to happen a lot at airports. On a different note, people are the largest attack vector. A well-crafted phishing or spearing email at the right time may be able to fool the right person.
That's a great point. I mean, I think most internal breaches really aren't because of disgruntled employees. It's really through innocent mistakes. Nobody intentionally doing this.
You got it. So there are some controls that you also need to put against the application. Something like need to know. So the controls need to protect users from accidentally making mistakes sometimes. Now the other little catch is something called watering holes, which is another problem. And these are compromised websites serving up malware. New York Times and the NBC were victims, which means, of course, anyone that touched it also became a victim. So really, user awareness training is a must, especially with social networking. But knowing security controls are only a baseline, can you really trust who's accessing your data? This includes employees, partners, clients, and again, Eric Snowden. Could you stop that data from getting out your corporation? Another thought, anytime your data is sent over the public cloud, Gmail, Hotmail, peer-to-peer, online storage, you have to assume it will become public. So what can you do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Detecting suspicious access to critical data is a must. Remember, assume you have malware in your network. Suspicious activity really is an early warning sign. Now, a centralized logging system of contextual analytics and threat intelligence is absolutely essential. Again, the single person, you need that kind of capability. Monitor your critical data and application lifecycle. And who's using your data? It needs to be protected during usage, transmittal, storage, including backups and upgrades. It's a must to have visibility into all network and web protocols, including encrypted. Remember, you can't monitor and control it when you can't see it. Sorry.
Sure, yeah. Now, somewhat related to this, BYOD, bring your own device. That's the trend in organizations to allow employees to use and connect their personal devices, such as smartphones, to the corporate network. Now, this has got to be causing IT managers a lot of consternation, but it does seem, like a trend that's here to stay.
As we know, cybercrime is like a business, and the hacking activity is driven mainly, guess what, by profit. As per recent reports, smartphones are being sold at 2 times the rate of PCs, and they'll probably go up. So a growing sector, as we know, will attract more investment, in this case, criminals. People also access their bank accounts from these things, and in some cases, they also access your data remotely. Again, emails and attachments is your personal data. So what's the threat? Regardless of what we say about Microsoft, they're making great strides to secure their OS. Plus, there's a huge industry of security controls to protect the Windows environment. On the other hand, smartphones are just starting to get there. How many people have AV, anti-malware, URL filtering on our smartphones?
Well, I know that I certainly don't. I haven't really given much thought to putting it on.
There you go. So patchy controls are just getting there. Bottom line, the criminals are ahead of the curve on this one. So regardless of the marketing hype, either Apple or Android can be compromised. Android, unfortunately, is the targeted #1 smartphone OS. iOS, well, they're not far behind. And the latest fingerprint scanner, you heard it can be fooled.
That's right.
And locked devices, as you know, they're not so safe. So overall, though, jailbroken devices are a much greater risk. Watch out for those. Free applications are full of Trojans, and as you know, there's nothing that's free. So what steps can you take? Again, ensure remote devices have security controls in place before accessing your data. IT needs to be involved from the beginning before the users call. And wireless detection is a must to fend off not only those rogue access points, but also the hotspots.
All right, and finally, cloud. I mean, this is an even bigger trend in IT. And cloud, whether it's connecting to compute infrastructure on public services like Amazon or Microsoft Azure, or say, using software as a service like Office 365, Salesforce. The organization's potentially exposed anytime they're connecting to this.
And Craig, there's I'm thinking like three different types of cloud. There's your hosting, private, public, your business application, like as you mentioned, Salesforce, Office, Google Apps, and then the user application cloud. We can't forget about that. Gaming, peer-to-peer, Facebook, to a certain degree, Google Drive, Dropbox. But for shared hosted facilities, unique threats exist. So if you have a shared pipe, think about it. If you have a DDoS to one client, everyone is affected. And a shared hosted server, imagine if it's got one IP, well, if that IP is blacklisted, then basically your business is blacklisted because really when you look at these threat intelligence services, some of them only have an IP address. A different perspective is if there's a compromised client, they could be affected to the underlying services or hypervisor. So all of them are affected. Now, for applications on user clouds, as we like to call them, if your confidential data is copied into a cloud and encrypted, call it Gmail, on-site storage, whatever, then the data has to be now assumed public. So, back to the magic question. How do you protect yourself? So for hosted facilities, you must address the whole data and application lifecycle. Remote access, local access by admins, upgrades, backups, failover scenarios. You also have to make sure that the service provider can take care of your compliance requirements. And just an FYI, PCI 3.0 is coming out this November. Now, it won't be in effect until January 1st, 2015. But again, look at your hosting contracts. Make sure that can be taken care of. Now, after the service is active, it may be difficult, costly, or maybe even impossible for the hosting provider to take care of you. Bottom line, your security policies need to extend to the cloud. And lastly, you're ultimately responsible for the security of your data, even if it's outsourced.
Okay, thanks, Carlos. Now that we know more about these security risks, what are the next steps? So what does a business do to ensure that they're going to be protected ongoing?
There's a lot of vendors out there that just, here's the latest widget security device, and this will solve all your problems. But as we know in reality, we need a good process. And really, you need executive support to establish a budget and cooperation from the other parts of your organization. It needs to be a top-down approach. And security must be a business enabler. I know we've heard this before. The executives need to understand the threats and risks from a business perspective. Any other approach, in a nice way of putting it, you probably won't be heard. A DDoS attack is much the same as having your cable cut. Either your whole pipe or just your application is down. In either case, your business is offline. DDoS in any form or compromise needs to be considered and planned for. So remember, the criminals or hacktivists have an integrated plan, unfortunately. You need an integrated process with all the affected teams working together. Assume you have an intruder or what we call a parasite amongst you. It's a good start. And remember, Sony shut down their PlayStation Network. And the magic question is, would your organization be ready to shut down their online application?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Carlos. That's great. Now, again, stick around for a few minutes at the end for the Q&A. So before I conclude today's session, I'd like to poll the audience one more time, and this time to ask your assessment of your organization's security readiness. So let's bring that poll question up. So in light of today's discussion, how confident are you of your organization's security posture? Very confident, somewhat confident, not very confident, and if you're a little shy, you can prefer not to answer. So take a few seconds here to make a selection, and we'll find out. All right, somewhat confident. Well, that's a good sign. So I'm glad that some people are taking this seriously to some degree, and actually very impressed to see 23% are very confident. There's I'm thinking, Carlos, though, there's still some actions they might want to take. Even if you're very confident of your security posture, it might not be a bad idea to conduct a penetration test just to confirm that the processes you put in place are actually working. Is that right?
Yeah, and Craig, I mean, most organizations typically have a penetration done on their online applications.
Mm-hmm.
Usually once every 6 months, worst case once a year.
Okay, and then those that are somewhat confident, again, that's probably a good idea to to probe and find where those weaknesses are, and maybe plug them up.
Absolutely, and you know what? For the organizations, they'll probably have on-site tools to do that, and for everybody else, they can always bring in a consultant to do it for them.
Good stuff. Okay, so let's conclude the formal part of the presentation. I'm just going to sum up what we talked about here. So again, some key takeaways before we go. Businesses rely on the internet now more than ever before. For many organizations, it's really quite literally a lifeline. The service provider's role is also critical. So the network, by design, has to be secure, it's got to be reliable, and through the use of peering agreements, it's got to be connected globally to the world's largest ISPs and content providers. And then finally, security, folks, is not an option. The threats out there are real, and increasingly it's going to be the smaller organizations that are targeted. So use this knowledge. Knowledge is power, so be aware of these threats. Protect yourself against them by following a pervasive security strategy. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation. Before we get to the Q&A, I'd just like to mention a couple of online resources that we'll be directing your way in a follow-up email we'll be sending. One is an internet security ebook where we delve much deeper into the top 5 security risks. And the other is just a link to the Allstream blog, which is called Expert IP. This site, which is award-winning, by the way, includes a number of articles covering topics that we discussed today. It's really a great resource, so I encourage you to visit that when you get a moment. Okay, so let's proceed to the Q&A, and we have some questions up here on the board, and I'm just going to bring those up. So, all right, so from Stephen, first question, and I think this is going to be for Dan. I've heard we are running out of IPv4 addresses for years. Are there any hard stats on when? I've heard that too, Dan.
It's a good question. So ARIN is the outfit that manages all the IPv addresses globally. It stands for American Registry for Internet Numbers. And if you do go to their website, there's all kinds of wonderful statistics that'll show you that and more. And what you'll see clearly is the number of requests that ARIN gets for IPv4 addresses, they cannot fulfill. It's very scarce. They're only allocating very small incremental blocks of IPv4 addresses to certain providers and so forth, and you have to effectively show how you're managing and using them and so forth. So you'll clearly see from those statistics that there's very limited IPv4 addresses going forward.
Okay. Now, Randy has another question, I think, again, for Dan. The question is, you can have a very fast fiber optics and high-speed everything. However, the bottleneck is going right into the back. Sorry, the bottleneck is actually going right into the back of the computers, is it not?
Yeah, so Randy, yeah, that's somewhat true, right? I guess it goes to you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? But as PCs and servers become more powerful in their processing power and so forth, you want to make sure that your network can handle it and more. And once that request leaves your premise and it needs to get to your end destination, you want to make sure that it takes the fastest, most optimized route and the performance of that network to bring back your data or your application or whatever it is you're using it for in an ideal manner.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and now I think we've got a question here for Carlos from Shabir. What is a basic scanner that can be used to scan the network for potential threats?
Well, there's some free scanners out there. Probably the first one I'd start off with is Nessus. It is an open source tool. Now you can also purchase it if your organization, which means you get quicker updates on signatures, but that would be probably a first step. There are also some online services that you can also use, but that would be a first step.
Okay, so you're saying there's just like an initial scan you'd want to do, but there's probably stuff that it's not going to catch or that you have to do stuff ongoing.
Absolutely, and again, when we look at these things, there's a free and then there's a pay service, and basically when you look at the difference between the two is you can even get an online service to scan everything, but then you have to interpret what the results are. Okay, that's not for the faint of heart, and the reality, if anybody's ever had a penetration test, there's a lot of false positives because the information you get back may not necessarily be true. So the difference where things get more expensive is if you get an actual service or managed service to actually do the scan for you. And what they do then is they interpret the data and basically prioritize what you should fix.
Okay.
All right? Now, where life gets interesting is you can have your typical network application test, or you can have what they call an application pen test. So where that is they literally go through, log into the application, and try and subvert the controls. And, of course, that can be much more expensive depending on how many and how big the applications are.
Okay, we just talked about expensive because there was another question from Stephen saying security testing can be expensive. No?
It can be expensive, especially if you go at the application layer. But remember, if you're in the application layer and your application is static, I know you're just serving up documents, that's not really a big deal. However, if it's integrated and you're doing financial transactions or you have anything like Amazon as an example, so the more contextual information, the more dynamic the application is, the more time it's going to take. Guess what? The more skill set it's going to take, and the more expensive it will be.
All right, and I guess there's a cost-benefit trade-off here. I mean, it can be expensive, but what's going to be the cost of a security breach if you don't do anything, right?
You know, we're back.
You don't catch this stuff.
You're right, but the thing is, we're back to the business question. It's about risk, right? So the best practice is typically when you put an application online or it's an upgrade or something, you really should do an application pen test. But again, at the same time, there are costs involved, and the business needs to know of those risks.
Okay, now just looking at the clock, I think we've got a couple more questions we can do. There's one from Joe. You talk a lot about DDoS. How can you protect me? We did talk a lot about DDoS. I think we do actually have a network-based solution, don't we?
We do, and again, so back to this, there's the two types, right? So if you think about it, and I've seen, I think, a couple of questions on that too. It's like which should you get? You know, if you're starting from scratch, what's the first thing you should get? Well, you know, if your circuit is flooded, you can't do anything, right? So as a minimum, you should try and get some kind of a flooding protection from, and typically that has to be from your ISP because, again, the attack has to be stopped in the cloud. From an application standpoint, that's when you either most likely have an on-site appliance. What it'll do is that'll protect all your applications because anything that's TCP or UDP based, it'll protect against that. And the key point, it'll give you the visibility just to make sure no one is actually trying to kick the door down.
Okay. Let's see here. There was another question. I'm just trying to see here. There's one question here. Where do you see the biggest strategy gaps for your clients in Canadian business generally? Now that sounds like a, I don't know. That could go either way. Let's put that question to you, Carlos.
The easy ones, right?
Yeah.
You know, I think what's happening out there is that if you listen to the security vendors, each one of their tools, the latest tool, is going to solve all their problems. Okay, and that's the issue. People will buy the next tool. It sounds great. However, if you don't integrate that into an overall process, okay, it's not going to fix the problem, right? Just think about it. You know, if the application folks aren't connected with the security folks and so forth, and you have a tool that gives you an alert, unless everybody works together, they really can't take care of the actual attack itself.
Okay.
So really have an integrated process and having a security program supported by executives is really the way to go.
Okay, so I think we're about out of time. So thanks so much. Again, if we didn't get to your question, we'll be sure to answer you directly via email. And obviously, if you think of another question afterwards, feel free to email us or contact us directly through our LinkedIn profiles. We'd love to hear from you. So again, we hope you found the presentation helpful. The link to the on-demand rebroadcast is going to be emailed to you shortly. And again, for any information you'd like to know about Allstream Business Internet or our comprehensive set of security solutions, please feel free to contact us by phone or by email, connect@allstream.com, phone 1-855-299-7050.